Honorable President, distinguished delegates, representatives from UN entities and civil society. Before turning to my thematic report, let me quickly brief you about some recent activities I've undertaken. In October 2023, I presented a report on the affordability crisis affecting enjoyment of the right to adequate housing globally. Today at 1 p.m., there will be a side event on this issue, co-organized by Brazil, Germany, Finland, and Namibia, and the International Union of Tenants, that I would like to invite you cordially to. I would like to recall that affordability is a core element of the right to adequate housing as set out in international human rights law. My report to the General Assembly calls on states and other actors to renew their commitment to ensure affordable housing and provides several recommendations to address the crisis. Last year, I contributed as a member of the Academic Advisory Committee to the report of the Secretary General on inclusive policies to address homelessness, which was prepared in collaboration with the UN Habitat and UNDESA. I am very pleased that the UN General Assembly has subsequently adopted a resolution on homelessness, which should lead to further steps, including stronger measures to curb evictions and measures to increase affordable housing. In January this year, I had the opportunity to study these issues more intensively during an academic visit to San Diego in California, about which I have shared my views with the United States government. I'm currently working with the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights on a special report on the decriminalization of poverty and homelessness, following up Human Rights Resolution 43/14, which called upon states to ensure that their laws and regulations do not result in punishing or imprisoning people for having no access to adequate housing, for street living, or engaging in other life-sustaining activities. This special report will be presented by the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights as an addendum to his regular report during the next Human Rights Council session in June. We hope that this report will spark or catalyze a movement to end criminalization of poverty and homelessness. Distinguished delegates, let me now briefly turn to the increasingly systematic or widespread and massive and arbitrary destruction of civilian housing and infrastructure during too many conflicts around the world, all in blatant violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We have seen or are seeing such destruction in Aleppo, Grozny, Mariupol, Myanmar, and now in Gaza and parts of Sudan. When people lose their homes, they lose more than physical structures. A home is more than property. It is also the repository of memories, hopes, and aspirations. In my 2022 report to the UN General Assembly, I call for the recognition of massive destruction of housing in conflict as a crime against humanity of its own standing, domicide. I regret to note that so far my call has not seen adequate response. On the contrary, what is happening in Gaza shocks the conscience of humanity. Since October 7th, 2023, more than 70% of all housing stock in Gaza and more than 80% in parts of northern Gaza have been damaged or destroyed, and over 1.5 million persons have been displaced from their homes. More than 1 million people are crowded into Rafah, grossly lacking in adequate shelter during winter, facing starvation and disease. All that makes housing adequate. Access to services, jobs, or culture, schools, religious places, universities, hospitals have all been leveled. This scale of and intensity of destruction is far worse than in Aleppo, Mariupol, or even Dresden and Rotterdam during World War II. With other special rapporteurs last week, I called upon states to stop arms transfers to Israel that are being used to destroy housing and displace the people of Gaza. Such arms transfers risk complicity in systematic violations of the right to adequate housing, which may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or acts of genocide under international law. Distinguished delegates, last December I was kindly invited by the Netherlands to visit the country, and I wish to thank the government for its excellent cooperation before, during, and after the visit. I would also like to thank all those who took time to meet me and share their stories, including persons living in housing precarity. I had the opportunity to visit many locations, including social housing neighborhoods, homeless shelters, reception centers, a caravan site, and villages affected by earthquakes caused by drilling for natural gas. My report analyzes the need for legal protection and enjoyment of the right to adequate housing in the country, the state of housing crisis, and its real causes. I draw particular attention to the vulnerable situation of refugees, asylum seekers, migrant workers, students, caravan dwellers, and persons with disabilities and persons experiencing homelessness. I'm also grateful to the Government of Netherlands for its comments on my draft report, which were very useful. My report recommends that Netherlands incorporate the right to adequate housing fully into the constitutional legal order, not only as a goal of state policies, but as a human right. It also makes a number of detailed and practical recommendations to actually fully realize the right to adequate housing, including how to prevent and address homelessness and discrimination in the housing sector, better tenant protections and rent control, improve oversight of housing associations, and improve housing conditions for asylum seekers, migrant workers, and refugees, while ensuring non-discriminatory treatment for all refugees and asylum seekers from Ukraine and elsewhere, especially in accessing jobs and housing. Let me now turn to my thematic report on resettlement. While forced evictions and arbitrary displacement have long been recognized as gross violations of human rights, less attention has been given to what the displaced persons endure after displacement. There is a right to be resettled under international law, and such resettlement must be in conformity with international human rights norms. However, while resettlement after displacement is globally acknowledged to be essential, many displaced communities have never been accorded durable solutions or offered the opportunity to resettle in conformity with international human rights standards. Regrettably, when people have been resettled, the outcomes have often been very poor, undermining the human rights of those affected and plunging them into more precarity and new forms of poverty. In my report, I argue that there is a need to develop human rights principles and guidelines on resettlement, building on existing human rights treaty law, international human rights standards, legal principles enshrined in national laws, and best international practices. The purpose of such guidelines is to close a significant protection gap, to harmonize existing standards and regulations, and to ensure that any resettlement is planned and carried out in conformity with human rights. My report reviews the existing international legal framework applicable to resettlement, analyzes how resettlement has been carried out to date, and what impact it has had on the enjoyment of human rights of those who were resettled. Often, resettlement is poorly planned and carried out without adequate and meaningful participation and consultation of those affected. Persons resettled often face loss of land and access to natural resources, increased homelessness or placement into grossly inadequate housing, loss of access to public infrastructure services, work opportunities, education or healthcare, loss of jobs and livelihoods, or food insecurity. Often, resettlement has increased the marginalization of the affected persons, contributed to the breakdown of social networks, increased morbidity and mortality, caused serious psychological impacts, or resulted in violent conflict, including with host communities. Indigenous people, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, rural people, women, children, and older persons are disproportionately affected. Very often, resettlement has gone hand in hand with disproportionate use of force by security officials, arbitrary detention, torture, and killing of persons opposing resettlement. The social costs of involuntary resettlement that fails to respect the dignity, capabilities, and worth of displaced people can be enormous. My report argues that it is necessary, first and foremost, to avoid and prevent any unnecessary resettlement. And if resettlement becomes necessary or is called upon due to disasters, to do it well that minimizes disruption and accords benefits. The reasons for poor resettlement processes and outcomes are multiple. Lack of appropriate national legislations and regulations, or when they exist, neglect or superficial respect for them. A blind belief that displacement is assumed to be for public benefit. Underplaying negative impacts while planning. Insufficient consultation and participation. Insufficient and inappropriate forms of compensation, lack of monitoring of resettlement outcomes, and lack of effective access to remedies for those affected by resettlement projects. When grievance mechanisms exist, including those by international financial institutions, they too often fail to ensure that the rights of the affected persons are effectively protected. Dear delegates, there is a need for profound reform of how resettlement is planned, implemented, and financed. We need a human rights-based approach to resettlement and international guidelines that detail what that means. Global standards for resettlement that are consistent with sustainable development goals would contribute to better project outcomes and significantly advance the protection of the rights of those displaced. My report concludes with several recommendations, including reform of current laws, practices, and institutions that govern land, property, and housing, including eminent domain, to avoid or reduce the incidence of displacement and resettlement. Avoid evictions and involuntary resettlement of communities, whether in the context of conservation, ecotourism, eco-city development, or any other reason. Ensure participation of those affected in planning, implementation, and monitoring of resettlement, and in particular respect for the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people before any resettlement is undertaken. strengthen access to justice, including by easing access to courts, non-judicial bodies, and international inspection panels that provide real remedies, develop benefit-sharing models that go beyond monetary compensation for resettled people based on negotiated agreements. Finally, I would like to call upon you to support the development of a set of principles and guidelines on resettlement that I intend to present to the Human Rights Council next year, after a series of consultations with states, UN agencies, international financial institutions, business actors, and civil society organizations and experts. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your comments and questions.